Hello again, everybody. This is Dan Clouser, and welcome back to the Journey of My Mother's Son podcast. Now I'm joined with Cory Rosenke, who is a author, theologian, presenter, and coach. Cory, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this.
Absolutely. So have I. It's going to be a great conversation. Before we get started, just introduce yourself to the listeners. Who is Cory today?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's very interesting how oftentimes we just kind of ask that question, and yet there's so many layers to it. So I'll keep it simple. I am a pastor and an author, as you mentioned. I currently live in Silicon Valley, California, but I am not from here. I am a rural Canadian boy. Who moved down here 7 years ago, and I got to admit, it was a shock to my system to come from rural Alberta, rural British Columbia, and all of a sudden be amongst all these people in Silicon Valley. But I've adapted. So on one level, that's who I am. On the spiritual level, I would say I'm a sinner saved by grace. And yeah, I'm just kind of on a mission right now to communicate with people about answering the question of exactly what you just asked: who we are, who are we? And that's kind of my goal in life right now, is to help people wrestle with that and hopefully come to a meaningful and helpful answer.
Yeah, I love that. What what is it that got you started on that journey to want to help others find those answers?
Yeah. Well, I think it started with my own journey of wanting to find the answers. I was one of those kids I was raised very poor. We were homeless for a significant season of our life. And I was one of those kids, some might call a freak, but I was one of those kids that, when company came over and all the kids were outside, playing tag, I was the little boy that was sitting in the living room listening to the older people talk, and from a very young age, I was asking the question of why. Why is our life different than other people's? What does all this mean? I experienced some tragedy in my early life and wondering why. And right from a very young age, that question of why sent me into philosophy. At 9, 10, and 11 years old, I was reading Plato and Aristotle and Confucius and, the kind of the great philosophers, and asking that question, why. Didn't find my answers there. I found just more questions, which made me move into psychology. Again, trying to find that question of why. And I remember for a while I was really big into Freud and his whole idea of the development of personality and the id and the ego and the super ego, and realized once again that there was more questions than answers. And then I moved into neuroscience, as a lot of people have done recently, a fascinating study of the neuroplasticity of the brain and the amazing impacts of brain chemicals. And but what I quickly discovered was any kind of search for meaning or purpose, or the answer to the question why, that ends up in philosophy or psychology or neuroscience, what you're really studying is mechanism. You're not studying source. And that can be very helpful to understand how things work, right? If this happens to you, your brain is going to release this chemical, which is going to make you want to do this response. That's all helpful information. But again, it's mechanism, it's not source. And so really that search for source led me deeper to what I call non-biological. and so some people will say that is a conversation of faith or religion when we start talking about our non-biological selves, but I don't. I believe it's as scientific a discussion as we can have. Most of us know intuitively that we exist beyond biology, but very few of us are living like it. And so from my own journey, from, like I said, philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, to the place I am now, it's just changed my life, and I want to give other people the opportunity to experience that same transformation.
What what was it about that tragedy that happened to you in your younger years, that kind of sent you down this path of exploration and you know again wanting to kind of discover why we're here?
Yeah. I think part of it, I mean, I think to a certain degree, it's somewhat just the way that I'm built. I know that for other people, I can say, that experience similar tragedy, in some cases even the same tragedies, Um, for them, I know some who went to alcohol and drugs. I know some who have became obsessed over their career. We respond different ways. In my particular case, I responded with wanting to answer the question why and wanting to leave no stone unturned. And so for me, I would say all of us, all of us have this question inside of us, and oftentimes we're trying to mute it through different things. So, like I said, some people are muting it through through some sort of substance abuse. Some people are muting it just simply through obsessive behaviors in the areas, whether it's a sports obsession or a work obsession or a sex obsession or whatever their obsession is. We try to mute it, but ultimately there's a voice inside of us that's asking these questions, and sooner or later we have to answer it. And I'd say that a longer, healthier life will happen when we can answer that question satisfactorily sooner.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And I think, it's amazing, when you look at, some famous people and some celebrities and stuff like that, who even with, what society will tell you is success, having money and a big house and fancy cars and all this stuff, they're still battling, many times depression, which is what makes them, then turn to, it really goes to show you that all these material things that society tells us we should have and should be collecting, and of course, coming from the mouth of someone who's a minimalist who lives in an RV and drives his house around the country, and understands when we go into a gift shop that I can't buy a new shirt unless I get rid of one of my old shirts because I only have X amount of space. But yet that's so different than what society tells us, and it shows that peace doesn't come from anything that the world has to offer. It has to come from inside. It has to come from something higher. So, what throughout your journey, um, what was it that brought you to the realization that comes from within, it comes from a higher power?
Yeah, I ultimately believe that it all comes down for most of us to a moment of self-revelation where we kind of to a certain degree surrender to what we've always known. And like you just kind of mentioned earlier, what we see in the world today is people desperately trying to satisfy a non-biological craving with biological things, and it doesn't work. Which is why I just heard a quote by Jim Carrey the other day. I generally use older quotes, but this Jim Carrey quote, the Canadian comedian, he said, I wish everybody could experience riches and fame so they could realize that's not the answer. Right. And the truth of the matter is, you're right. It doesn't, none of us ever feel quite famous enough, quite rich enough, quite healthy enough. And when we do kind of reach a place or a moment where we're like, wow, I have it all, two things either happen. We realize that we're vulnerable and that we might lose it all, right? Which means we don't have peace, or we realize that there's nothing there, right? That's another old quote by an old author that says, I wish I'd known when I was young that when I reached the top, there's nothing there. And I think that is very indicative of what's happening in our world today. I mean, when you think of it, the generations that are alive today have more than any generation in the history of the world. We have more access to prosperity, to education, to freedoms, to comforts, to leisure, even in your RV. Your RV has conveniences that kings and queens didn't have very long ago. We have more than every generation in the history of the world, and yet virtually every study shows we're more unhappy than ever. Right. And I think it's because we've believed, and I'm going to maybe step on some toes here, I want to be cautious, the lie of the American dream. The American dream has always said that if you will reach this specific summit, you'll have peace, right? Sometimes they say, if you reach this sexual summit or this financial summit or this educational summit or this relational summit, you'll have peace. And ours are the generations that have reached the summit and discovered there's nothing there. And I believe it's because we've been trying to satisfy a non-biological craving with biological things.
So, shift a little bit. the title of the book is The Magnetic Heart of God, Understanding the Five Cravings of Your Soul. Without giving away too much, tell me a little bit about where does the title itself come from?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I don't mind giving away too much because I go really in depth in the book that I could never go into, on a podcast. So I don't mind kind of letting the monkey loose, so to speak. Um, Ultimately, I believe that there are five cravings of the soul, which we have misassigned oftentimes in today's world to psychological cravings. They are not psychological cravings because they are not biological cravings. They are non-biological. They're deeper, right? And I think that's kind of the first step we need to realize is that we are more than biology. We aren't just a brain or a body. We are a soul. In fact, it is our soul that best defines us. And so in my book, I identify five cravings that I call cravings of the soul, that are the source material for all of human ambition. You can look throughout all of history. Anything that anyone has ever done can be boiled down to these five cravings. They are the motivating source. Um, and yet, as I mentioned, our tendency is to try to satisfy these cravings in biological places, people, places, and things. And it's never enough. Just think of it right now. The two richest people on Earth are the two guys leading the space race, right? You got Elon Musk and Bezos. They literally have everything the world has to offer. Are they happy? Are they at peace? No. In fact, so much so they have to reach for the stars to try to find something else, some other source of meaning or purpose or some sense of significance. And so ultimately, these five cravings I propose cannot be satisfied in earthly places. They can only be satisfied in our maker. And that's why I ultimately call the book The Magnetic Heart of God, Understanding the Five Cravings of Your Soul. When we can look at humanity and say definitively, I know what you're looking for. Dan, you're on the road living in an RV, but I know what you're looking for. You're looking to satisfy these five cravings. There's other people out there who have giant houses and they're paying some giant mortgage. I know what they're looking for. They're looking for the same things you are, but they're just looking in different places. Ultimately, you aren't going to find the answer on the road. These people aren't going to find the answer in their castle. We have to look elsewhere. We have to look towards our maker.
I think that's so important. For me, uh, being out on the road and being out in nature um, helps me find him
Yeah.
easier. Again, that's just for me. I'm not saying that's for everybody.
Yeah.
We all find it in our own space. Where that is, and I think that's one of the things. God will always meet us where we are,
Yep.
regardless of where we are. So,
Yeah.
When you talk about we're searching, um, irony in that. Quite frankly, we don't have to go anywhere to find it.
Yep.
It's always there. So, you know, throughout your own journey, um, when was it that you found that really didn't have to search, that he was always there with you?
Yeah. Well, for me, it was I was raised in what you might call a Christian home, though it was kind of a dysfunctional one, in a lot of levels. I left home when I was 14 years old, um, determined to find the answers and convinced they weren't where I just left them. Um, and so for me, as I mentioned, right from a young age, I was asking the question why in all these different areas and different places. And for me, it was actually a moment. I would say I was 21 years, 22 years old. I was in a little study that I had, and I was reading the Iliad by Homer for probably the 10th time. And of course, that's the Greek mythology. It's a story, right, of Hector and Achilles and the Trojans and the Greeks and the war and the Trojan War and the Trojan horse. All this Greek mythology. And I was reading it once again for, like I said, the 10th time probably. And when you're reading the book, you see all these gods. You see these people at war, and the gods are at war. Right? Certain gods have sided with the Trojans, other gods have sided with the Greeks, and they're battling out in heaven or whatever they call it, just like they are on Earth. And they're betraying each other, they're cheating on each other. They're just chaos. And I remember just kind of sitting up for a moment and realizing God isn't like this. But if he's not like this, then who is he? Right. And that was kind of for me that spark that is like, well, now that I've answered the question, I believe that there is a God, there is a higher power. The next question that follows is, who is he? And that, of course, led me on a lifelong search to discover who he is. And by extension, ultimately discovering who I am. Because if I'm made in his image, which I believe we each are, the two questions go hand in hand.
So, it's one thing to go on this journey for yourself and to, find the answers for yourself. What was it in you that determined that you wanted to give back others trying to find these answers as well? Because again, I mean, I think a lot of people, um, you know, will find it and search it out on their own, but I think it takes a special kind of person to then go and share that with others and help them.
So as a pastor, I also serve as a counselor and a coach to a group of people, and we have something we say in coaching, and that is that awareness precedes transformation. So, and when you come to a new awareness, that's what can begin the change. And when we look at the world today, what I think is very clear is we see a busy world like an anthill, everybody crossing the globe. There's just, the world is traced with paths of prosperous and educated multitudes, all looking for hope and meaning, right? But they don't know what their purpose is, right? And ultimately what we're doing is we're looking for something, but we don't know what it is. And when you don't know what you're actually looking for, when you can't name it, how can you possibly find it, right? And so for me, what I've wanted to do is help people articulate what it is they're looking for. And when you know what you're looking for, you have a far better chance of finding it. And so I speak to Christians, I speak to Buddhists, I've spoken to atheists, psychologists, I spoke to someone who claimed to be a witch a couple weeks ago. My goal is simply to say, hey, regardless of where you are right now, this is what you're looking for. And ultimately, I believe there's only one place you're going to find the answer to your question. But let me start by helping you say, hey, this is what you're looking for. Now that you can name it, you have a better chance of success in finding the solution or finding the answer or finding that which satisfies.
What having those conversations with people with different kinds of faiths, what is your approach to kind of find your common ground?
Yeah. Well, my common ground is to talk about the soul, is to talk about our non-biological selves. I think that if you're as a Christian, as a pastor, as a theologian, I believe that God has revealed himself. He's revealed his truth in his word. But I recognize that we're not all there yet. But what we can rally around to starting point is to realize that, I can look at you, Dan, and if I am truly going to love you or serve you, or if we're going to collaborate in some meaningful way, I need to look at you and realize that you aren't just a brain and a body. Like there's a shape sitting in front of me that I see. There's a shape sitting in front of you that you see, but this is not who we are. We are ultimately souls made in the image of God. And these souls have cravings, and they're looking for satisfaction, right? And so to me, that is the point where I tend to start with people, because most everybody believes in a soul. They may have come at it from a different, some of them just kind of believe because they've been told, but ultimately we have a testimony inside of us that knows we exist beyond biology. Oftentimes I'll get asked the question, what evidence do you have that we have souls? And I'll generally start by saying, you are your own best evidence that you have a soul. You know it. There's something inside you that reaches out, that tries to reach beyond. C.S. Lewis once said, and in his book, Mere Christianity, it's a brilliant quote. He said, creatures do not have cravings unless satisfaction for those cravings exists. And then he gives some examples. He says, a baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. If there had never been such a thing as food, there would be no such thing as a craving for hunger, right? A baby duckling wants to swim in a pond. there would be no such thing as a craving to swim if there was no such thing as water. And yet we as humanity have in us these cravings for a creator, these cravings to live forever, for that matter, right? And the fact that those cravings exist prove that the non-biological exists all by itself. And even when you talk about common ground, I would say that think of it this way: virtually every culture in the history of the world has come to an awareness of their non-biological selves. They know that they exist beyond their bodies. Doesn't matter if it's tribes in Papua New Guinea, right, or in Africa, or I often will say that the Europeans believed in a soul, and they came to North America and they brought religion, but they came to a people who already believed in a soul and had already formed a religion to try to describe and understand what they already knew about themselves. When the Romans believed in a soul, but when they invaded Britain, and landed their legions north of the White Cliffs of Dover, they knew they had an awareness of the soul, but they came to the Britons who already had an awareness of the soul and had formed a religion to try to describe it. So the awareness of the soul was not evangelized like religion was. It did not spread across the world by word of mouth. Every culture came to the same conclusion independently. Right? And that's as scientific a fact as you can get when you talk about the soul. We know that we exist beyond biology. And so that is the point to me of my point of unification to start with. And that's where I want to start the conversation with people. And now in my book, I reach faith-based conclusions that some people may say, hey, I'm not quite ready to reach your conclusion there. But everybody can be benefited by coming to an awareness of their non-biological selves and what that non-biological self is looking for.
Love that. Or is there anything that we didn't cover that you think would be valuable to our listeners?
Yeah, I would just kind of leave this. I've kind of talked about the cravings, but perhaps I haven't said too much about them. All of us have 5 cravings of our souls. They are not simply psychological cravings, they are deeper. And they are the reason why we want to get married and why we want to get divorced. They're the reason why we want to hit the road for a road trip, and the reason why we want to build an ivory tower. The cravings are this: security, identity, independence, significance, and innocence. These are the 5 cravings that are the root. They are the motivating source of every human pursuit. And we choose to look for satisfaction in different places. Unfortunately, we tend to look for satisfaction in biological places, which doesn't work out for us, right? But ultimately, if you want to understand your spouse, why they behave the way they behave, if you want to understand that politician that you hate, why they behave the way they behave, you want to understand yourself, you can understand yourself and these people by understanding these 5 cravings. And that's what I present in the book, is an in-depth view into these 5 cravings of our soul that once we can name them, we can actually begin to pursue them in a healthy and effective way.
How do people find out more about you if they want to get a copy of the book, if they want to engage you in your coaching? How do they find you on the internet?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I just have a simple website. It's CoryRosenke.com. That is the best place where kind of all the information can be found in one place, CoryRosenke.com. There's a link there. People can contact me if they have questions or if anyone is interested in transformational coaching. But also there's links to the book there. The book is really available everywhere books are sold. So if someone forgets that name, Cory Rosenke, I often wish I had a name like John Smith, because then everyone would remember it. But unfortunately, my name's Cory Rosenke, so you have to figure out how to spell it.com. But also you could just search the Magnetic Heart of God, understanding the 5 cravings of your soul, and it'll pop up right there for you.
Love it. I will have links to all that in the show notes as well. So we'll make it easy for the listeners to just click on there and find out more about you for sure. But Cory, this brings us to our final question. As you know, the subtitle of the podcast is Many Little People in Many Little Places, which comes from the opening lyrics of the Michael Franti song Gloria, which go, when many little people in many little places do many little things, then the whole world changes. So it's one of the little things that Cory does on a daily basis to make the world a little bit better place.
I look in the mirror and realize that that's not who I am. I step on the weigh scale and realize that's not who I am. I look at the diplomas on my wall and realize that's not who I am. I am something more. And I think when we as little people begin to realize that we were actually created purposefully and beautifully, that will change your day. As long as it's the mirror and the weigh scale and the diplomas that define me, life is different and it's harder and it's not as joyful. So I would say that don't believe the lie of the mirror, the weigh scale, or the diploma. You are more. You have been created for more. And God has designed you to live in connection with him. And when you do that, it will change everything.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Yes, sir. Folks out there listening, be sure to check out my other podcasts and blogs at journeymymotherson.com. While you're there, pick up a copy of one of my books. And again, I really appreciate you being on the show. And I think this conversation is going to help a lot of our listeners. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir, and great success to you on your journey.
Thank you.